October of 1941 smelled of salt, oil, and photographic chemicals. By then, I had been in the Imperial Navy for 5 years, long enough to stop feeling like a boy, and not yet old enough to understand what it meant to be a man. My world had narrowed to 3 things: the cold metal of an aircraft fuselage under my boots, the weight of a camera in my hands, and the thin ribbon of horizon where sea met sky. I was a petty officer in the Naval Air Service, assigned to reconnaissance and photographic work. In the personnel files, I was listed as an observer. In truth, I was an eye that the Empire had strapped to the belly of an airplane. When they first told me I would be flying a special mission over the Hawaiian Islands, I felt pride before fear. Hawaii was a name spoken in lower tones in the operations rooms, a place on the map ringed with arrows and notes. The American Pacific Fleet lay there, everyone said, sleeping in its harbor. The talk among pilots was that someday we would have to wake it with fire. Our aircraft did not look like war. The twin-engine machine that had been assigned for the mission wore civilian markings, a painted registration number instead of military codes. The guns had been removed. In their place, we fitted extra fuel tanks and a camera system that had been hand-built by Navy technicians. The camera was a heavy, box-like thing with a lens like a small cannon and a clockwork mechanism that could expose one frame every few seconds as long as the handle was wound. I had carried cameras before, lighter ones for routine patrol work. This one felt different in my hands, heavier not just in weight, but in purpose. We left from a northern base in late October, flying a long arc eastward over empty water. The flight plan was presented to us as a simple test of range and endurance, a navigation exercise. No one believed that. Fuel calculations had been done to the leader. The navigator had spent days poring over charts, his fingers tracing lines over and over until the paper grew thin. We carried no bombs, no torpedoes, nothing that could damage a ship. Only film, only eyes. The Pacific in late autumn is a vast mirror. From altitude, the waves flatten into a textured gray sheet. On clear days, the sky is so bright it bleaches color from the world. We flew high, higher than was comfortable for the engines or for our lungs. The air thinned until each breath felt like drinking through a cloth. My fingers stiffened inside their gloves. Cold bit through the flight suit. I had to force my hands to move as I checked the camera settings for the 10th time, flexing each finger individually to keep blood flowing. Hours passed, marked only by small rituals. The pilot tapped the fuel gauge with a knuckle every few minutes to make sure the needle still moved. The navigator marked our position in pencil on the map, a tiny cross in the middle of a blue nothing. I checked the camera, checked the shutters, checked the winding mechanism. My hands were shaking slightly from the cold and the altitude. I told myself it was only the cold. Then the first dark smudge appeared on the horizon. From that distance, Oahu was only a change in texture, a darker band between sea and cloud. As we approached, details resolved slowly, like an image emerging in a chemical bath. A line of surf, a curve of coastline, patches of green that must be fields or forests, or golf courses for American officers who lived lives I could not imagine. The pilot adjusted our course with small, precise movements. We had rehearsed this part many times on paper, but paper does not feel the engine vibration, or smell the fuel burning, or hear the wind screaming past the open camera port. The plan was simple in outline and intricate in execution. We would approach from the north, cross the island at high altitude, and then descend in a gentle, wide circle that would carry us over the harbor in a way that might be dismissed as a civilian scouting flight or a lost transport. The radio would remain silent. If challenged, our cover story was that we were a civilian aircraft blown off course, lost in navigation, seeking only to correct our position before turning home. If fired upon, there was no plan beyond hope and speed. As we crossed the northern shore, I could see little figures moving on the ground far below, cars on roads tiny as ants, houses clustered in small towns, a white line of beach where waves folded and broke in silence I could not hear. It was the harbor I wanted, the harbor they all wanted, the reason we had flown so many cold hours over empty ocean. The pilot gave me a small nod over his shoulder, the signal we had agreed upon. No words on the intercom, just the nod. I unlatched the panel in the floor and swung the camera into position. Cold air roared up through the opening, stealing what little warmth remained in the cabin. My eyes began to water immediately. The first sight of Pearl Harbor from the air is something no photograph can fully capture, though I would try. The water lies calm in a broad, sheltered basin, protected from the ocean swells by the arms of land. On that day in late October, it was studded with ships, battleships with their armored hulls and multiple turrets, each one a small floating fortress, cruisers leaner and faster, destroyers like smaller siblings. Some lay moored side by side, their decks crowded with equipment and men whose faces I could not see, but whose presence I could sense. Others sat farther out, alone on their moorings, swinging gently with the tide. From above, the ships looked like a child's metal toys arranged by a careful hand on a painted pond. I began to take pictures. The camera was mounted in a vertical position, lens pointing straight down through the open panel in the floor. I lay on my stomach, harness clipped to a ring, one eye pressed to the viewfinder. The harbor moved slowly beneath us as the pilot flew the planned track. Each time the framing was correct, I depressed the shutter release. The mechanism clacked and whirred, film advancing by the width of one frame. Each exposure was a thin silver rectangle that would, if we survived the flight and the return and the darkroom work, be transformed into coordinates for someone else's death. I counted silently between shots to keep rhythm. 1 heartbeat, 2, 3, press. The battleships passed beneath, unique in outline but similar enough in their vulnerability. I made sure to capture each pier, each anchorage point, each channel leading in and out of the harbor, the oil tanks on the surrounding hillsides, the airfields with their rows of parked aircraft lined up like toys on a shelf, the repair docks, the ammunition depots. All of it went into the camera one slice at a time, frame after frame, building a mosaic of destruction that had not yet occurred. We made one full pass. The pilot banked smoothly, bringing us around for a second run at a slightly different angle to give the photo interpreters overlapping coverage. I could feel sweat under my flight suit despite the cold wind tearing through the open panel. The strain of concentration was like holding a heavy weight at arm's length for too long. If I missed a frame, if I allowed a ship to slip through the viewfinder uncaptured, the hole in the record might someday become a hole in an attack plan that would cost lives. Japanese lives. Our lives. The thought made my hands shake harder, and then, in one frame, I saw them. The battleship below filled the viewfinder, its deck a pattern of gray metal and white paint. But this time the camera was low enough, or the light was right enough that I could see details I had not noticed before. Men, individuals, not just white dots, but actual human beings moving across the deck. One stood near the rail, and from my angle I could see he was smoking, the tiny spark of his cigarette visible even from this height. Another sat on a hatch cover, legs dangling, head tilted back as if enjoying the sun. A group of 3 or 4 stood clustered near a gun mount, and one of them made a gesture with his hand that might have been laughter. My finger hovered over the shutter release. They were so small, so far away. But in that frozen moment, they became real in a way the ships had not been. The battleship was a target, a problem to be solved with geometry and explosives. But the man smoking at the rail was someone's son. The man sitting on the hatch had a name I would never know. The group laughing near the gun mount would be standing in that exact spot in a few weeks when fire fell from the sky, and they would die not knowing that a Japanese photographer had looked down at them through a camera lens and seen them as human. The intercom crackled, the pilot's voice distorted by static. "We are behind schedule. Did you get the shot?" I pressed the shutter release. The camera clacked. The film advanced, but my hand had trembled just for an instant, and I knew even before the film was developed that this one frame would be wrong. Blurred, smeared, the only imperfect image in a perfect series. We left the island as quietly as we had arrived, climbing back into the thin air over the ocean. The coastline receded. The harbor vanished behind clouds and distance. The pilot allowed himself one glance back, then turned us on the long course home. I closed the floor panel, latching it with fingers that still shook. The wind stopped roaring. The cabin filled with the quieter sound of engines and the blood rushing in my ears. Only when land had disappeared completely did the pilot speak again into the intercom. He asked if I had the shots. All of them. Every angle. I answered yes. My voice sounded strange to me, flat and distant. His shoulders loosened by a fraction. The flight back felt longer than the flight out. The adrenaline that had carried us over the target ebbed away, leaving a hollowness in its place. The engines droned on, unchanging. Fuel burned away in a slow, deliberate line on the gauge. My hands had stopped shaking, but now felt numb, as if they belonged to someone else. When at last our own coastline rose from the sea hours later, it felt less like returning home and more like surfacing from a dive that had gone too deep. We landed in the late afternoon. The shadows of hangars and towers stretched long across the runway, painting everything in bands of gold and black. Ground crew ran to meet us, chalks in their hands, questions on their faces that they did not ask aloud. I unclipped my harness with fingers that fumbled at the buckle. It took 3 tries. A mechanic had to reach in and help me, his face carefully neutral. I cradled the camera as I climbed down, holding it against my chest like something fragile. My legs nearly buckled when my boots touched the tarmac. The mechanic caught my elbow. He asked if I was injured. I said no. He looked at me for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded and turned away. The film canister was removed from the camera by a petty officer from the photographic unit who met me at the hangar door. He took it with both hands, cradling it as I had cradled the camera, and disappeared through a doorway marked with red signs warning against entry. I was told to wait in the corridor outside. My legs still felt weak. I sat on a wooden bench against the wall and stared at my hands. They were trembling again. The darkroom was somewhere beyond that door, a small, windowless space where the world narrowed even further than it had in the aircraft. Red safe light glow, trays of chemical baths, the sour smell of developer and fixer mixing in the air. I had done this work myself 100 times on routine missions, but today they kept me outside. The mission was too important to allow the distraction of the man who had taken the images. They wanted technicians, not witnesses, not someone whose hands might shake over the developing tanks. I sat on that bench for what felt like hours but might have been less. Time lost distinction without sunlight or clock or anything to mark its passage, except the occasional opening and closing of doors elsewhere in the building. I tried not to think about the blurred frame, one mistake in a series of perhaps 200 images. Probably it would not matter. Probably no one would notice. Probably the information it contained was duplicated in other frames taken seconds before or after, but the thought gnawed at me anyway. Low voices came from behind the darkroom door, muffled by the walls. The faint tick of a timer, liquid sloshing in tanks, the sound of something being lifted and moved. Then silence again. I pressed my palms against my thighs to stop them from shaking and succeeded only in making my legs shake instead. When they called me in at last, the room smelled so strongly of chemicals that my eyes watered immediately. The first prints lay on the drying rack, still curling slightly at the edges, held flat by wooden clips. They were larger than I had imagined they would be, each one a window the size of a book page onto the harbor we had flown over that morning. The detail was astonishing. Every ship was crisp. Every pier, every building, every road was etched in gray tones that made them look more real than reality. I could see the wake patterns of small boats moving between the larger vessels. I could see the way shadows fell across decks. I could see, on one image, a car parked beside a warehouse, so small it was only a dozen dark pixels, but unmistakably a car. Senior officers began to appear, drawn by invisible signal, men in dark uniforms with more stripes and stars than I had ever seen in one room. They entered quietly, almost reverently, as if stepping into a temple. They bent over the photographs in silence at first, and then began to speak in low, precise voices. They counted ships aloud. They traced with fingers the routes aircraft would take. They pointed to fuel depots, ammunition stores, repair facilities. One officer produced a measuring ruler from his pocket and began calculating distances between moorings. The harbor, which had felt abstract and distant from the altitude of our flight, became in that cramped, chemical-smelling room a set of problems to be solved and vulnerabilities to be exploited. I stood in the corner, forgotten. My role was finished. I had brought back the images. What happened next was for men with higher ranks and broader responsibilities. Someone pinned the photographs to a large corkboard on the wall. They overlapped them with transparent sheets on which circles and arrows were drawn in grease pencil. Depth markings were added from submarine charts. The positions of anti-aircraft batteries were estimated from visible gun emplacements. Approach angles were calculated. Escape routes were debated in voices that never rose above conversational volume. I watched all of this as if from underwater, sound muffled and distant. The images that had been mine for a few hours no longer belonged to me. They belonged to the Empire now. They belonged to the plan. They belonged to the men who would, in a few weeks, use them to navigate their way through darkness to those same docks and piers and anchorages. One of the officers noticed me standing in the corner. He was an older man, gray at the temples, with a face that suggested he had spent many years squinting into two bright horizons. He looked at me for a moment, then walked over. He asked my name. I told him. He asked if I had taken all of these photographs myself. I said yes. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already guessed. Then he did something I did not expect. He bowed, not deeply, but enough that it was unmistakable. A superior officer bowing to a petty officer. He said that my eyes had given them victory before the first shot was fired. He said that history would remember this mission even if it could never speak my name. He said that the Emperor's trust had been placed in my hands, and I had proven worthy of it. I did not know what to say. I said thank you. It seemed inadequate. He placed one hand briefly on my shoulder, then turned back to the photographs. Later, after the officers had left and the darkroom technicians had filed the negatives in protective sleeves and locked them in a safe, I was allowed to look at the images one more time before they were taken away. I stood alone in the empty room, the overhead light harsh after hours of red safe lights. I found the frame I was looking for near the end of the series. The battleship, the men on the deck, the smoker at the rail, the man sitting on the hatch, the group laughing near the gun mount. All of them were there, but blurred. Motion blur from my trembling hand. The ship itself was recognizable, the outlines clear enough for identification, but the human figures had become indistinct smears. Ghosts already. I stood looking at that photograph for a long time. No one came to hurry me. The building had grown quiet. Outside, night had fallen. I could hear the distant sound of waves against the harbor breakwater, the low hum of generators, the occasional call of a night watch making his rounds. I reached out and touched the edge of the photograph with one finger. The paper was still slightly damp. The image blurred under my fingertip, leaving a small mark. I pulled my hand back quickly, afraid I had damaged it, but the mark was barely visible. Just a fingerprint. My fingerprint. The only evidence that in one moment I had hesitated. I took that photograph. I should not have. The regulations were clear. All images from classified missions were to remain in official custody. But the room was empty, and the photograph was one of dozens, and the blurred, imperfect image seemed to me less like a military document and more like a confession that needed a keeper. I folded it carefully and slipped it inside my jacket against my chest, where it lay like a cold hand over my heart. No one noticed, or if they did, they said nothing. That night, I lay on my bunk in the barracks, unable to sleep. The other men in my section were quiet, wrapped in their own thoughts, or already unconscious. A small lamp burned at the far end of the room, casting long shadows. I could hear someone breathing heavily, almost snoring. Someone else muttered in his sleep. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling something loose against the building's exterior wall. I closed my eyes and saw the harbor, not the photographs, but the real thing. The view through the camera port, the ships moving slowly beneath, the men on the decks, the smoker at the rail. I had looked down at him for perhaps 2 seconds, long enough to see the ember of his cigarette, long enough to see that he was young, or at least I imagined he was young, long enough to know that in a matter of weeks he would be fire and water and gone. I opened my eyes. The barrack ceiling was close and dark. The shadows did not move. I reached under my pillow and felt for the folded photograph. It was still there, the paper slightly warm from being pressed against fabric. I did not take it out. Just knowing it was there was enough. A reminder, a witness. The moment when I had seen them not as targets but as men, and my hand had betrayed me by shaking. Word filtered down in the following days that the operation based on those photographs had been approved at the highest levels. The name Pearl Harbor began to be spoken openly in certain rooms, and never outside them. Pilots were assembled for special training. Torpedo crews drilled at low altitude over calm waters, practicing runs at dummy hulls anchored in sheltered bays. Model harbors were built from wood and string so that attack leaders could rehearse their approach until they could fly it blind, until the shape of the harbor was burned into their minds as deeply as it was burned into mine. I was asked to provide enlargements of specific areas: the anchorage where the battleships lay in their neat rows, the channel entrance with its narrow mouth, the submarine base tucked into the eastern corner, the fuel tank farm on the hillside. Each new request made the eventual purpose less hypothetical and more certain. The dates on the internal memoranda shifted from conditional to definite. No longer if we strike, but when. No longer whether, but how many aircraft and from which direction. My role became smaller as the planning grew larger. The photographs had been handed up the chain of command and were now in rooms I would never enter, studied by men whose names I would never know. My work was finished. I was thanked politely and told to return to regular duties: routine patrols, training flights, film development for less critical missions. The days became ordinary again, but the weight in my chest where the folded photograph lay did not diminish. In the nights between missions, I lay on my bunk and saw the harbor behind my eyelids. I could close my eyes and visualize the exact pattern of ships, the lengths of shadows at different hours, the way morning light would strike the water and make it look like hammered metal. When I slept, I sometimes dreamed that I was above the harbor again, camera in hand. But this time, when I looked through the viewfinder, the ships were already burning and the men on the decks were running, and I could not make my hands press the shutter release, no matter how hard I tried. On the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, I did not fly. My reconnaissance role had been fulfilled weeks ago. The strike force had steamed toward Hawaii days earlier, their course plotted from the charts my photographs had helped create. My orders that day were to remain at the base, ready to receive and process any film that might be sent back with returning aircraft. It seemed unlikely that combat pilots would carry cameras into such a mission, but procedures demanded readiness. The day began like any other. The sky over our own anchorage was clear and cold. The sea was the color of slate. Men moved about the base with that peculiar quiet intensity that precedes planned violence. Radios crackled with coded traffic. In the operations room, officers stood clustered around maps, their faces expressionless, hands clasped behind backs. I worked in the photographic section, organizing supplies, film canisters, developer chemicals, fixing baths, the ordinary materials of my trade. My hands moved through familiar motions while my mind circled the thought that somewhere far away, aircraft were approaching a harbor I had seen through a camera lens, and soon there would be fire. Shortly after noon, local time, the first coded message arrived. I was not in the operations room when it came through. I was in the dark room checking the temperature of the chemical baths out of habit more than necessity, but the word spread quickly through the building in the way news always does when it is too large to contain. Whispered voices in corridors, footsteps moving faster than usual, doors opening and closing. I emerged from the dark room into a hallway full of men who were trying not to run but moving just short of it. Someone told me to report to the operations room. I went. The room was crowded but silent. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, facing a desk where a communications officer was writing down messages as they came through the radio, transcribing them from code into clear text. His hand moved steadily across the paper, each character formed with careful precision despite the speed. The messages were brief. Target reached. Attack commenced. First wave striking now. Subsequent updates came in bursts over the following minutes and hours, describing in dry, truncated phrases the hits achieved, the ships burning, the airfields struck, the casualties unknown but presumed heavy. There were no adjectives, no exclamation marks, no indication of emotion. War never describes itself in the language newspapers later use. It records only facts, whether the target was reached, whether it still exists afterward. An officer I did not recognize entered the room carrying a folder. He opened it and removed several photographs. My photographs. The images I had taken weeks ago. He pinned them to a board on the wall, and as each new message arrived describing damage to a specific ship, someone would step forward and mark that ship's position on the photograph with a red grease pencil. I watched from the back of the room, unable to move closer, unable to look away. The first mark was placed on one of the battleships in the central anchorage, a small red X, then another, then a circle around a group of ships moored together. then a line drawn across the airfield showing the direction of the strafing runs. Each mark was made calmly, methodically, as if this were an academic exercise and not a record of men burning and drowning and dying in explosions I could not see but could imagine with perfect clarity. By the end of the first hour, the photograph was covered with red marks. Almost every major ship had been hit. Both airfields had been struck. The fuel tanks, the repair facilities, everything I had photographed was now burning or sinking, or both. The harbor I had seen through my camera lens, peaceful and still under autumn sun, had been transformed into exactly what the marks on the photograph suggested. A graveyard. Someone near the front of the room began to applaud. Others joined. Within seconds, the entire room was filled with the sound of hands clapping, men congratulating one another, voices raised in barely controlled triumph. An officer made a short speech about honor and destiny. Another spoke of the emperor's will being manifest. The noise grew louder. I felt something rise in my throat, hot and sudden. I pushed through the crowd toward the door, shouldering past men who did not notice or did not care. I made it into the corridor, turned a corner, found a door to the outside and stumbled through it into cold air. I vomited into the gravel beside the building. Once, then again, my body trying to expel something that could not be expelled. When there was nothing left, I stayed bent over, hands on my knees, breathing hard. Saliva hung from my mouth in a thin string. I spat. My stomach clenched again but produced nothing. The photograph in my jacket, the folded one I had stolen, pressed against my ribs. I could feel it there, a thin square of paper that weighed nothing and everything. The blurred figures, the men who by now were almost certainly dead. I straightened slowly, wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. From inside the building came the muted sound of celebration. Out here, there was only wind and the distant noise of waves and the taste of bile in my mouth. No one came looking for me. No one noticed I was gone. I stood in the cold for a long time until my hands stopped shaking and my breathing returned to normal and the nausea faded to a dull ache. Then I went back inside. The celebration continued for hours. As more detailed reports came in, the scale of the success became clearer. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, multiple cruisers hit, destroyers burning, hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground. The American Pacific Fleet, the great obstacle to our expansion, had been crippled in a single morning. The men in the operations room allowed themselves smiles that reached their eyes. They spoke of tactical brilliance, of courage rewarded, of a new era dawning. That night, the base commander addressed the assembled personnel in the main hangar. He spoke of the historic victory. He praised the pilots who had carried out the attack. He mentioned briefly the reconnaissance work that had made the operation possible. He did not name me specifically, but a few men glanced in my direction. I stood at attention with the others, eyes forward, face expressionless. After the address, after the dismissal, after the long walk back to the barracks in darkness, I lay on my bunk and stared at the ceiling. The other men talked quietly among themselves, voices animated with the excitement of victory. Someone laughed. Someone else described how he imagined the attack must have looked. Bombs falling, explosions blooming. The talk went on until late. I said nothing. When they finally fell silent and sleep took them one by one, I remained awake. I reached under my pillow and pulled out the folded photograph. In the darkness, I could not see the image, but I did not need to. I knew every detail. The blurred ship, the smeared figures, the man at the rail with his cigarette, the man sitting on the hatch, the group laughing near the gun mount. I wondered if they had seen the aircraft coming. I wondered if they had time to be afraid. I wondered if the blur in the photograph, caused by my trembling hand, had been a kind of mercy, erasing their faces before they could be burned away. I folded the photograph again and put it back under my pillow, closed my eyes. Sleep would not come, but I lay still anyway, listening to the breathing of the other men, waiting for dawn. In the weeks that followed, my role became both more important and less acknowledged. The success at Pearl Harbor meant that aerial reconnaissance was now seen as a decisive weapon, one that could shape battles before they began. I was assigned to more missions, longer flights, higher risks. The camera became as essential to the aircraft as its engines. We flew over enemy harbors, enemy bases, enemy convoys. Each time I took photographs. Each time the images were developed and analyzed and turned into targeting data for someone else's strike. But something had changed, not in the work itself, but in how I carried it. I still did my duty. I still made sure every shot was framed correctly, every exposure calculated for maximum clarity. But now, when I looked through the viewfinder, I saw not just ships and structures, but the spaces where men lived and worked and would soon die. I saw the details my camera would capture and the details it would miss, the machinery of war and the flesh that operated it. The other photographers noticed nothing. I was as professional as ever, perhaps more so. My images were consistently sharp, well composed, properly exposed. No one asked why I had stopped joking during flights. No one remarked that I no longer joined the quiet celebrations when our strikes proved successful. If they noticed at all, they probably assumed I was simply focused on the work, dedicated, serious. Only I knew about the photograph hidden in my footlocker, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Only I knew that sometimes, late at night when the others slept, I would take it out and look at it under the dim light of the barracks lamp. The blurred figures, the only imperfect image in a perfect series. The only moment when my hand had known something my mind had not yet accepted. What none of us understood then, not the pilots or the observers or even the admirals, was that the clarity the camera offered could be turned against us just as easily. The lens did not care who owned the aircraft. It did not recognize flags or anthems or divine purpose. It saw only shapes and light and recorded them without judgment. Somewhere far across the ocean, men in American uniforms were already doing to us what we had done to them. They too were sending aircraft to peer down through glass. They too were bringing back images for their own operations rooms. They too were drawing red marks on photographs of our ships, our bases, our cities. But in those weeks after Pearl Harbor in late 1941, with my photographs still pinned to boards in rooms I would never enter, and my superiors still congratulating one another in measured tones, it was impossible to imagine that the same harbor I had photographed might one day be a staging ground for fleets sailing to our shores, or that my camera, which had given us our greatest victory, would soon become a tool for documenting our long, terrible defeat. The photograph under my pillow remained, a reminder, a confession, a thin piece of paper on which the only evidence of my doubt was a blur caused by a trembling hand. I kept it through everything that came after. The war changed shape in the months after Pearl Harbor, though at first we did not see it clearly. Victory followed victory in those early days. Wake Island fell, Guam, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, the fortress the British had called impregnable, surrendered in a matter of weeks. Our forces swept south and east across the Pacific like a tide that nothing could stop. On the maps in the operations room, red arrows pushed deeper into blue ocean, and each new advance was marked with satisfaction that bordered on certainty. We had awoken the Americans, yes, but we had also crippled them, or so we believed. I flew reconnaissance missions over newly captured territories, photographing harbors we now controlled, airfields we now operated, coastlines that now fell under our protection. The work was similar to what I had done before Pearl Harbor, but the context had shifted. I was no longer documenting targets for future strikes. I was recording evidence of our expansion, proof of dominance. The camera captured what we wanted it to capture: harbors full of Japanese ships, airstrips lined with Japanese aircraft, flags bearing the rising sun hanging from buildings that weeks before had flown other colors. But even in those images of triumph, small details emerged that troubled me. Supplies piling up on docks because there were not enough trucks to move them inland. Airfields that looked operational in photographs but sat half empty. The distances between our forward positions and our supply lines growing longer with each new conquest. These were facts the camera recorded whether I wanted it to or not. I learned to frame my shots carefully, to emphasize what was strong and minimize what was weak. It became a kind of editing before the film was even developed. In April of 1942, I flew reconnaissance over the Coral Sea and photographed 2 American aircraft carriers operating in waters we had assumed were under our control. The images were sharp, clear, undeniable. The carriers were not fleeing. They moved with purpose, their formations tight and professional. I transmitted the contact report and returned with the film. The battle that followed was declared a tactical victory because the Americans withdrew first. But in the operations room, there was no celebration. One of our carriers had been sunk. Casualties were higher than expected. And most troubling, the Americans had fought with a competence that surprised everyone. They were learning, adapting. The war was not going to be the short, decisive campaign we had been promised. I developed film from routine patrols and overhead scraps of conversation between intelligence officers who did not know I was listening. One of them said the Americans were reading our codes. The other said that was impossible. The first insisted. How else did they position their carriers so perfectly? The second officer said that even if it were true, there was nothing to be done. To suggest the codes were compromised would be to question decisions made far above their authority. The conversation ended. I stood in the darkroom holding undeveloped film and felt something cold settle in my chest. If they could read our messages, then every position I reported, every image I transmitted, might be visible to them before our own commanders could act on it. The camera gave us eyes, but what good were eyes if the enemy could see through them? Then came June. Then came Midway. The operation was planned with confidence that approached certainty. A massive force of ships and aircraft would seize a small atoll northwest of Hawaii, drawing out what remained of the American Pacific Fleet for a decisive battle. Our fleet was larger, our pilots more experienced. The briefings spoke of inevitable victory. I flew reconnaissance over Midway itself before the main force departed, photographing the tiny island from extreme range. Runways and buildings clustered on a thin strip of coral, barely visible above the water. It did not look like something worth the enormous effort being devoted to its capture, but I was told the value lay in forcing the Americans to commit their remaining carriers. Once they did, we would destroy them. The strike force sailed. I remained behind to process whatever film came back. Days passed. Radio traffic increased but remained coded. I worked in the darkroom, developing images from routine patrols, waiting. Then, on the 4th of June, the first clear messages began to arrive. I was in the operations room when they came through, not because I belonged there, but because everyone had been summoned. Something had happened, something large enough that even petty officers were being gathered to hear it. The communications officer stood at the front of the room, reading from a message slip. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly. Carriers hit. Multiple carriers burning. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. 3 names spoken aloud. 3 of our finest carriers struck by American dive bombers. The room had perhaps 40 men in it. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was so complete that when someone in the back row shifted his weight and his boot scraped against the floor, the sound was deafening. Then the 4th name, Hiryu. All 4 carriers of the main strike force, gone in a single day. I watched as the communications officer walked to the large status board on the wall where magnetic markers represented our ships. He reached up and removed the marker for Akagi, then Kaga, then Soryu, then Hiryu. 4 markers placed in a small pile on the desk, 4 carriers that had existed that morning and did not exist now. Someone dropped a pencil. It clattered against the floor and rolled. In that silence, it sounded like a tree falling. I looked around the room at faces I had known for months. Senior officers, intelligence analysts, other photographers. All of them wore the same expression. Not grief, not quite. Something closer to incomprehension, as if the words they had heard were in a language they could understand individually, but could not assemble into meaning. An officer near the front asked how this had happened. His voice cracked on the last word. No one answered. The question hung in the air like smoke from the distant burning ships. I left the room. No one noticed. I walked through the corridor, through a door, out into daylight that felt too bright. My legs moved without conscious direction. I found myself at the photographic section, pushed through the door, walked past the work tables to my own locker. Inside, beneath spare film canisters and chemical bottles, was a folder. I had been adding to it for weeks. Reconnaissance images of Midway, the atoll from different angles, the runways, the fuel storage, the defensive positions. I had photographed the target we were supposed to capture, the place where our carriers were supposed to achieve decisive victory. I pulled the folder out and opened it. The photographs showed exactly what I had seen through the viewfinder, a small, insignificant-looking piece of coral and sand. We had sent 4 carriers and hundreds of aircraft to capture this, and instead, we had lost everything. I stood there holding the images of our objective that we had not achieved, the first time my camera had documented a target we failed to reach. The first time, the photographs in my hands were not proof of success, but evidence of defeat that had not yet been officially acknowledged. My hands began to shake, not like they had over Pearl Harbor when I saw the men on the deck. This was different, deeper. My whole body felt cold despite the warm air. I sat down on the floor with my back against the locker, the photographs scattered around me, and for several minutes I could not make my lungs work properly. Each breath came shallow and fast, as if I had been running. A young photographer found me there perhaps 10 minutes later. He was new, transferred in a month ago, still eager and bright-eyed. He asked if I was ill. I said no. He looked at the photographs on the floor. He asked if those were Midway. I said yes. He picked one up, studied it, then looked at me. He said it must feel strange to have photographed a place we were about to capture. He said soon we would have images of our flag flying over those runways. He said in a few months this would all be behind us. I looked at him, 19 years old, maybe 20. His uniform still crisp, his face unlined. He believed what he was saying because he had been told it was true and had not yet learned that being told something did not make it real. I wanted to tell him that we had just lost 4 carriers, that the war had turned, that the photographs in his hand were not of a future conquest, but of a defeat we were not yet ready to name. Instead, I said nothing. I gathered the images and put them back in the folder, stood up, told him I was fine. He seemed relieved and left. His name was Tanaka. I would remember it later. In the weeks after Midway, the operations room felt different, quieter. The maps were still studied, but with less confidence. New operations were planned, but the certainty was gone. Reports came in of American submarines sinking transports, American aircraft raiding forward bases, American Marines landing on Guadalcanal. The red arrows on the maps stopped pushing outward. Some began to pull back. I flew missions photographing our own positions now. Forward bases, supply depots, defensive installations. The images showed things that made me uncomfortable. Runways damaged in raids, patched with coral and debris. Ships sitting in harbors with visible damage, waiting for repairs that took weeks longer than expected. Supplies under tarpaulins because there was no proper storage. Fuel drums stacked haphazardly on beaches. When I filed these images, they were reviewed by intelligence officers who wrote reports emphasizing what they wanted to emphasize. The runways were operational, the reports would state, without mentioning they were barely functional. The ships were being repaired, omitting that we lacked proper facilities. The supplies were adequate, concluding without noting that adequate meant barely enough. I learned to recognize the pattern. The camera showed one reality. The reports described another. The gap between them widened slowly but steadily, and no one seemed willing to acknowledge it. In August, I was assigned to photograph a supply convoy that had been attacked by American submarines. We flew over the scene the morning after. The ocean was scattered with debris. 3 transport ships had been sunk. Their cargoes floated on the surface. Crates, barrels, equipment, and bodies. Hundreds of them drifting in the current, kept afloat by their life vests. I descended lower to get clearer images. The camera captured everything: wreckage, oil slicks spreading across the water in rainbow patterns, and the dead. They floated face down mostly, arms spread, legs dangling beneath the surface. Some were clustered together as if they had tried to help each other before drowning. Others drifted alone. I centered one in my viewfinder, a sailor in a life vest, face turned toward the sky, but submerged just below the waterline. His eyes were open, his mouth was open. Water had filled both. I could see it clearly through the lens, clear enough to see that he had been young, clear enough to see the expression frozen on his face. I pressed the shutter release. The mechanism clacked. The film advanced. My hand did not shake. That was what struck me as I flew away from the scene with the images recorded. 2 years ago, over Pearl Harbor, my hand had trembled when I saw living men through the camera. Now I had photographed a dead man floating in the ocean, his face clearly visible, and my hand had been steady, perfectly steady, professional. I had become accustomed to this. The camera had become an extension of my eye, and my eye had learned not to see certain things as real, only as images to be captured, data to be recorded, facts to be documented. Back at the base, I developed the film. The images emerged in the chemical bath one by one. Ships burning, debris floating, bodies drifting. all of it rendered in shades of gray, sharp and clear, and technically perfect. I hung the prints to dry and went to file the written report. The intelligence officer on duty reviewed my notes, then looked at the photographs. He studied them for a long moment. Then he separated them into two stacks. One stack contained images of the surviving ships and the general scene. The other contained the photographs of bodies. He pushed the second stack back toward me. He said, "We do not include these in operational reports." I asked why not. He said because they document casualties, not tactical information. I said the casualties are part of the tactical picture. He looked at me with an expression that suggested I had said something naive. He said that our role is to provide information commanders can use to make decisions. Photographs of dead sailors do not help them make better decisions. They only make the decisions harder. I looked at the stack of images he had pushed aside. The floating bodies, the young sailor with water in his mouth, evidence of what the war actually cost, removed from the record because it was inconvenient. I took the rejected photographs back to my workstation. I should have destroyed them. That was the implication. Instead, I filed them in a separate folder that I kept in my locker. Images that had been taken but would not be reported. Truth that had been documented but would not be acknowledged. That folder grew thicker over the following months. The missions continued. Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, each operation harder than the last. I photographed wrecked aircraft on abandoned airfields, damaged ships in harbors, supply shortages, equipment deterioration. The camera recorded all of it with perfect clarity, and increasingly, the images I brought back were reviewed, edited, filtered. The worst ones were set aside. The written reports emphasized resilience and determination while omitting the details that suggested we were slowly being ground down. It was in November that Tanaka, the young photographer who had found me on the floor after Midway, was assigned to fly reconnaissance over a contested area near Rabaul. He was excited. It was his first mission over truly hostile territory. He asked me for advice. I told him to stay high, take his shots quickly, do not linger. He nodded seriously, memorizing every word. He did not return. The aircraft was reported missing that evening. Probable enemy fighter contact. No parachutes observed. No radio contact after initial engagement. Lost with all crew. His personal effects were collected from his bunk. Not much. Some letters. A photograph of family. A good luck charm. They were boxed and prepared for shipment home. His camera and equipment were reassigned to another photographer, but his final roll of film had been loaded in the aircraft. It was recovered 3 days later when a patrol found the wreckage on a small island. The plane had crashed in jungle, broken apart on impact. The crew was dead, but the camera built to survive rough handling had remained partially intact. I was given the film to develop. It was damaged. Water had seeped into the canister, but I worked carefully and some of the images could be saved. I processed them alone in the darkroom, late at night, when no one else was there. The negatives emerged frame by frame. The first showed the view from altitude, ocean, cloud, distant coastline. The second showed enemy ships in harbor. The third showed the same harbor from a different angle. Standard reconnaissance work, exactly as I had taught him. Then the sequence changed. The framing became erratic, tilted, blurred. The aircraft had been hit. The images showed sky, then sea, then sky again as the plane spiraled, and then the final frame. It was completely blurred, motion blur so severe that the image was barely recognizable as anything except light and shadow. But the exposure had been made, somehow, as the aircraft fell. As the crew fought for control, or perhaps had already given up, Tanaka had pressed the shutter release one last time. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was training so deeply ingrained that even in the moment of death, his hand had found the camera button. Maybe he had wanted to leave some record that he had existed, that he had tried. I stood in the red safe light glow, looking at that final blurred image, and something inside me broke. I sat down on the floor of the darkroom. My shoulders began to shake. My chest tightened. And for the first time since the war began, I cried. Not quiet tears. Hard, gasping sobs that I had to muffle with my hands because I did not want anyone to hear. I cried for Tanaka, 19 years old, who had believed what he was told and died for it. I cried for the sailor floating in the ocean with water in his mouth. I cried for the men on the deck at Pearl Harbor whose faces I had blurred with my trembling hand. I cried because I had become someone whose hand did not tremble anymore, and I did not know if that made me stronger or more broken. When I could breathe again, I developed the rest of the images and filed them. Tanaka's last roll of film. Most of it was usable for intelligence purposes. The shots of the harbor, the enemy positions, all recorded properly before the aircraft was hit. I did not include the final blurred frame in the official report. I made a print for myself and added it to the folder in my locker, the folder of images that told a different version of the war than the one in official files. 2 days later, I was approached by a senior warrant officer. He was older, a career man who had been in service longer than I had been alive. He asked to speak with me privately. We walked to an empty hangar bay. He said he had been reviewing my work. He said the quality was excellent, always sharp, always properly exposed. He also said carefully that he had noticed certain images missing from recent reports, images that showed more than commanders needed to see. I said I only documented what was there. He said yes, but documentation required judgment. Some things were worth recording. Others, while true, were not helpful. He paused. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said there had been another photographer, based at Rabaul. Very talented, very dedicated, but he documented everything. Damaged equipment, supply failures, low morale. His images were technically perfect, but strategically problematic. Command felt his perspective had become too focused on difficulties rather than capabilities. He was reassigned, made an aerial gunner on a bomber. He was told it was an honor, a chance to contribute more directly. He accepted the assignment and flew his first mission 2 weeks later. The bomber was shot down. No survivors. The warrant officer looked at me. He said this was unfortunate. He said the photographer had been skilled and his loss was felt. He also said very quietly that some assignments were safer than others. I understood what he was telling me. My camera was my protection. As long as I used it appropriately, I would continue taking pictures. If I became inconvenient, I might find myself holding a different tool, a gun, a radio, something that would place me directly in the fire instead of above it. He asked if I understood. I said yes. He nodded and walked away. That night, I could not sleep. I lay on my bunk staring at the ceiling, while around me other men breathed and snored and shifted in their dreams. I thought about the photographer who had been too honest. I thought about Tanaka and his final blurred image. I thought about the choice I was being given, which was not really a choice at all. Document the truth and be removed, or document a version of truth that was acceptable and survive. I got up quietly and went to my locker, opened it, pulled out the folder of rejected images, bodies floating, damaged equipment, failed operations, and beneath them, the oldest image, the blurred photograph from Pearl Harbor, the man with the cigarette. The moment my hand had trembled, I spread them all on the floor. 2 years of war captured in 2 different archives, the official one that showed what we wanted to believe, and this one that showed what actually was. I sat there for a long time looking at them. Then I gathered them carefully and wrapped them in oilcloth, all of them together. The blurred frame from Pearl Harbor that showed my moment of doubt, the floating bodies that showed the cost we refused to count, Tanaka's final image that showed death arriving faster than fingers could press a shutter button. I would keep them hidden, not to show anyone, not to prove anything, just to remember, because someone needed to remember that beneath the strategy and the tactics and the official reports, there were men who died in water or fire or falling aircraft, and most of them had been young, and many of them had believed what they were told. I wrapped the bundle tightly and placed it at the bottom of my locker beneath spare uniforms and equipment. 2 versions of the war, the one I would continue to photograph for official purposes, framed and composed and carefully edited to show strength rather than weakness, and the one I would carry with me, hidden against regulations, heavy with truth no one wanted to see. As the year ended, I received orders for transfer to new duties in early 1943. The details were vague. Different assignment, different equipment, the same camera. I packed my belongings methodically, the official gear in one bag, the hidden archive wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of another. When I lifted the second bag, I could feel the weight of it, not the physical weight of paper and chemicals, the other weight, the one that pressed against my chest even when I set the bag down. The camera could not lie. It recorded what existed in the moment the shutter opened and closed: ships burning, men drowning, aircraft falling. Success and failure rendered in the same shades of gray because the lens saw no moral difference between them. But people could choose which images to look at and which to file away. They could choose to see victories and ignore costs. They could choose to believe in narratives that required overlooking the evidence that contradicted them. I had learned this lesson at Pearl Harbor when I photographed men who would die because of the images I captured. I had learned it again at Midway when we lost 4 carriers that were supposed to guarantee victory. I had learned it every time I brought back photographs that were reviewed, sorted, filtered until only the acceptable truth remained. Now I carried 2 sets of images, the ones I would continue to take for commanders who wanted to believe we were still winning, and the ones I kept hidden, evidence that we had been losing for longer than anyone would admit. I did not know yet how the war would end, but I knew which version of it was real. The camera had shown me, and I had made the choice to remember, even when everyone else chose to forget. The weight of that choice would stay with me, through all the missions still to come, through all the images still to be captured, through everything that followed. I shouldered my bags and left the barracks. Outside, the sun was rising over an ocean that stretched endlessly in all directions. Somewhere out there, the war continued. Somewhere out there, other photographers were taking other pictures, recording other truths that would be edited and shaped and made acceptable. But in my bag, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath regulation uniforms, was proof that some truths could not be edited away, only buried, only carried, only remembered by those who had seen them through the unblinking eye of a camera that recorded everything and judged nothing. I walked toward the airfield where my new assignment waited. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from the weight of the bags, from the weight of knowing. By the time the war reached its final years, I had been looking at it through a camera for so long that the world without a frame around it felt unreal. My transfer in early 1943 took me away from the islands and jungles of the Pacific and back toward the Japanese home islands. The official order said I was being reassigned to a rear area for duties more appropriate to my experience. Unofficially, I suspected someone had decided I had seen enough of the front, or perhaps I had seen too much and documented it too clearly. The new base lay near a coastal city on the main island. It was larger than any I had served at before, a complex of runways, hangars, barracks, and administrative buildings that hummed with constant activity. Aircraft came and went at all hours. Trucks rattled along roads bearing supplies. Officers hurried between briefings, arms full of files. The war, which on the outer islands had felt like a series of isolated struggles, here became something else, a machine, vast and impersonal and always in motion. My new assignment was to a photographic and intelligence unit responsible for processing reconnaissance film from multiple theaters. I no longer flew as often. Instead, I spent most days in dark rooms and windowless offices, developing film shot by others, assembling mosaics from overlapping images, annotating prints with grease pencil markings that turned landscapes into maps of possible death. The work brought me into frequent contact with officers from Army intelligence, Navy operations, and sometimes even representatives from the highest levels of command. They came to our section to see what the cameras had brought back. Burned out airfields in the Solomons, American ship movements near the Aleutians, Chinese troop concentrations far inland. The sheer volume of images was overwhelming. Walls filled with photographs laid edge to edge, entire coastlines reduced to shades of gray from one horizon to the other. It was here that I began to see not just individual battles, but the pattern they formed. The Americans were advancing, slowly at first, then more quickly, island by island, base by base. Their airfields crept westward across the Pacific like a line of ink spreading across paper. Their submarines choked our shipping lanes. Their bombers began to probe the edges of our homeland. On the maps in the briefing rooms, lines that had once curved outward from Japan now sagged and folded back. The red arrows of our advances had long since stopped expanding. Now the arrows that mattered were blue. My hands adjusted to the new work. Instead of gripping camera housings in a vibrating aircraft, they shuffled stacks of prints, adjusted in larger focus, held wax pencils. The chemicals in the darkroom attacked my skin and lungs more than the high-altitude cold ever had. I began to develop a persistent cough that tasted of fixer and stale air. At night, in the barracks, I would sometimes take out the oilcloth bundle from the bottom of my locker. Inside were the images I had kept outside official channels. The blurred photograph from Pearl Harbor, the floating bodies from the sunken convoy, Tanaka's final frame. I would look at them under the dim light and feel again the weight they carried. Then I would wrap them up and put them away before anyone could see. The others in my unit had their own ways of coping. Some drank whenever they could. Some made crude jokes in the darkroom, laughing too loudly at things that were not truly funny. Some threw themselves into their work with a fervor that bordered on desperation, as if perfection in processing film could somehow alter what that film depicted. In late 1943, we began receiving more and more photographic evidence of something new. American bombers operating close enough to strike our cities. At first, the raids were small, single aircraft or small groups probing defenses, hitting military installations on the periphery. The damage was limited. The photographs, taken from our own reconnaissance planes afterward, showed craters on factory grounds, damaged warehouses, a few burned buildings. The reports described these as minor incidents, annoyances, nothing to be concerned about. But the patterns changed. The enemy bombers began to arrive in larger numbers. They flew higher, in tighter formations. Their targets shifted from purely military to something broader. Industrial districts, rail junctions, port facilities embedded within civilian neighborhoods. The lines between combatant and non-combatant, always blurred in theory, disappeared almost entirely in the photographs I processed. One set of images remains fixed in my mind even now. They arrived in a pouch marked Urgent, film from Army reconnaissance flights over a mid-sized city in western Japan. The raid had taken place the previous night. Our aircraft had gone up after dawn to assess the damage. I developed the negatives as I always did, working by rote while the others handled different tasks. When I held the first finished print up to the light, my hand stopped. The city was gone. Where rows of wooden houses and narrow streets had stood the week before, there was now a blackened expanse of ash and rubble. The photograph showed entire neighborhoods reduced to patterns of char and twisted beams. Smoke still rose in thin columns from countless points. The only structures left standing were a few concrete buildings and the skeletal frames of factories. In the center of the image, a canal cut through the ruins. Along its banks, dark shapes lay in clusters. At first, I thought they were debris. Then I looked closer. They were bodies. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. People who had fled to the water to escape the fire that roared through the city. Some had made it into the canal and drowned. Others lay piled against the embankments where the heat had driven them down and the smoke had finished what the flames began. I stared at the print for a long time, long enough that another technician asked if something was wrong. I said no and went back to work. Developed the rest of the roll, print after print, showing the same devastation from different angles. Streets that no longer existed, bridges scorched, train cars melted into warped shells. The official report that accompanied the images described the raid as a strategic success. Key industries had been disrupted, it said. Transportation lines severed, war production hampered. Civilian casualties were mentioned in a single line, regrettable but unavoidable. I filed one set of prints into the official archive. Another set went into my oilcloth bundle. As 1944 turned into 1945, the raids grew larger. The Americans introduced a new type of attack, low-altitude night bombings with incendiaries designed to ignite our predominantly wooden cities. The photographs that came in afterward no longer showed isolated damage. They showed entire urban areas consumed. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. Names that had once been abstractions to me when I was stationed on distant islands now became images of destruction tacked to walls in our analysis rooms. Each new raid produced a fresh mosaic of burned districts. Each mosaic looked like the last. Blackened grids, white lines where streets had been scraped clean by firestorms, dark smudges where something larger had collapsed into itself. The officers who came to view the photographs spoke less now. There were fewer speeches about resilience. More questions about how long production could continue, how quickly facilities could be dispersed, how much of the industrial base could be moved underground or into rural areas. The answers were rarely encouraging. In these months, my work changed again. I was seconded to a joint investigative group tasked with compiling visual and testimonial evidence of war damage for higher authorities. It was no longer enough to send photographs. We were to visit some of the affected locations, record what we saw, and return with reports that could inform decisions about resource allocation and civil defense. So I began to travel, not to battlefields this time, but to ruins. The first city I visited after a raid was Nagoya. We arrived by train 2 days after a major bombing. The station itself was damaged but still functioning. The tracks into the city ran through areas that had escaped the worst of the fire, where buildings still stood, and life, in some form, continued. People moved through the streets with the stunned, brittle expressions I recognized from soldiers after combat. Shops were open, but their windows were broken. Trolleys ran, but slowly and without lights. We walked from the station toward the main industrial district. At first, the damage was scattered. A house burned here, a warehouse gutted there. Then, block by block, the destruction thickened until we reached the firestorm's core. There, the city had been erased. The ground was covered in a uniform layer of ash and charred debris, broken only by the remnants of larger structures, brick walls that stood alone, unsupported by anything around them, chimneys melted and bent, steel beams twisted into grotesque shapes by heat so intense it had made metal flow. The smell was indescribable, not just smoke and burned wood, something else layered beneath, thick, sweet, sickening. We moved slowly, documenting what we saw. I took photographs on the ground for the first time in years, framing shots of collapsed factories, burned out rail yards, entire neighborhoods flattened. At one point, near what had once been a residential street, my boot struck something that did not sound like wood or stone. I looked down. A human skull stared back at me from the ash, half buried, the bone white against the blackened ground. For a moment, I could not move. My throat closed. Then I raised the camera and took a photograph. Later, when I developed that image back at the base, the skull looked small in the frame, almost insignificant. But I could not forget that for a brief moment in that ruin, it had been the only thing in the world. We visited other cities. Kyoto, which was spared major raids for reasons no one in our unit understood, felt like a ghost of a Japan that no longer existed. Kobe, after a firebombing, looked like Nagoya multiplied. Osaka's industrial districts were cratered moonscapes. Each time I took photographs. Each time I filed official sets for analysis and unofficial sets for the bundle I kept hidden. The weight of that bundle grew. In the summer of 1945, rumors began to circulate that a new kind of weapon had been used against a city in the south. Something about a single bomb doing the work of hundreds. The first reports were confused, as they often were. Some said the entire city had vanished. Others claimed it was exaggeration. Then the film arrived. It was labeled differently from other reconnaissance footage. Restricted. Hand carry only. I was called into the darkroom by name and told to process it personally, under supervision. The negatives were unusual. What they showed was both familiar and entirely new. The first images were from high altitude, taken shortly after the explosion. A city by a river, its neighborhoods radiating outward from a central industrial and administrative zone. Where that zone should have been, there was now a circular area of almost pure white on the negative, which meant pure black on the print. A burned-out core where everything had been obliterated. Buildings near the center had vanished entirely. Farther out, they remained as charred frames. Farther still, roofs had been ripped away, walls collapsed, bridges had been twisted, railway lines torn up as if by some giant hand. The patterns of damage radiated outward from a point where there was now nothing. Subsequent images from lower altitude show details. Shadows burned into pavements where people had stood when the blast occurred. The outline of a man leaning against a wall, now reduced to a silhouette in negative against a surface that had been bleached by light and heat. A flight of stone steps leading nowhere, everything around them gone. Carts and bicycles fused to the street. We did not speak as we worked. The supervising officers watched each print emerge with faces more closed than usual. One of them, a man who had been unflappable in all the months I had known him, raised a hand to his mouth at one point and kept it there. The official explanation, when it came, called it a new type of bomb. A single weapon dropped from a single aircraft that had destroyed an entire city in an instant. There was talk of uranium, of chain reactions, of energy released from the heart of matter. These were things beyond my understanding. What I understood was the photographs. A city had been there one morning. By afternoon, it was not. Soon, there was another city, another set of images, another circular wound imprinted on film. After that, there were no more reconnaissance missions over enemy territory. The war ended. The announcement came from radios and loudspeakers in August. The emperor spoke directly to the people for the first time. His voice was thin and distant through the static, but the meaning was clear, even to those of us not accustomed to the formal language he used. We were surrendering. On the base, men reacted in different ways. Some wept, some stared at nothing. Some shouted that it was impossible, that we still had ships and planes and men willing to fight. A few talked about fighting on as guerrillas in the mountains. Most simply looked exhausted, as if a burden they had carried for so long they had forgotten its weight had suddenly been taken from them, leaving them unable to stand straight. I went to the darkroom. The shelves were full of negatives and prints. Years of war captured on thin strips of film and sheets of paper. Battles won and lost. Ports bombed, cities burned, men killed. Each image a fragment of something larger that no one would ever see in full. I opened my locker and took out the oilcloth bundle, unwrapped it on the workbench, spread the photographs out in front of me. The blurred frame from Pearl Harbor, the man with the cigarette invisible now, but present in my memory. The convoy bodies floating in the water, eyes and mouths filled with the ocean. Tanaka's last frame, a blur of light and shadow captured as his aircraft fell. The skull in the ruins of Nagoya. Streets turned to ash. Shadows burned into stone in a city leveled by a new kind of sun. Two wars looked back at me from the table. The one I had helped plan and justify with neat technical images, and the one I had tried to salvage in these rejected frames. The war of official narratives and the war of real consequences. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. I gathered the photographs quickly and wrapped them again. When the door opened, it was a younger officer I did not know well. He said that occupation forces would soon be arriving. There would be inspections. Certain materials were to be preserved for tribunals. Others were to be destroyed. He handed me a list. I scanned it. My heart began to beat faster as I realized what it meant. We were to identify and protect evidence of enemy attacks on civilians and infrastructure, the burned cities, the destroyed factories, the civilian casualties. These would be shown to whoever came to judge us. Proof that we had suffered as well as inflicted suffering. But anything that might suggest our own actions had been excessive, anything that might implicate senior leaders in decisions that could be construed as criminal under whatever laws the victors chose to apply, those materials were to be removed. Quietly, I looked at the list, then at the shelves, then at the bundle in my hands. The officer did not seem to notice my hesitation. He had other sections to brief, other lists to hand out. He left as quickly as he had come. I stood alone in the darkroom, holding a lifetime of images that were not on any list. The safest choice would have been to burn them. Feed them into the incinerator, along with countless other documents already marked for destruction. Reduce them to smoke and ash, indistinguishable from the smoke and ash that now covered so much of our country. But I could not. I thought of the men in those photographs, the sailor floating in the ocean, the civilians by the canal, the people whose bodies had left only shadows on stone, Tanaka and the last blurred frame he had ever taken. If I destroyed these images, they would become truly nothing, not even ghosts, just absent, as if they had never existed. And I thought of something else as well. The Americans would come. They would bring their own photographers, their own investigators, their own narratives. They would document what had been done to them. Pearl Harbor, Bataan, Guadalcanal, Okinawa. They would show the world scenes of their dead and their destroyed cities and say this was the story of the war. They would not be wrong, but it would not be the whole truth. Someone needed to remember that we had burned cities too, that we had sent men to die for illusions, that we had hidden casualties from our own reports, that we had allowed codes to remain broken because admitting otherwise was too dangerous for careers, that we had sacrificed young men like Tanaka not for victory, but for the continuation of a lie one more month, one more week, one more day. I could not change what had been done. I could not control what would be said in courtrooms and history books, but I could choose not to erase what I had seen. So I did something that, even now, I am not sure was courage or cowardice. I hid the bundle again, not in my locker this time. That would be searched. Instead, I found a space behind a loose panel in the darkroom wall, a narrow cavity between support beams where electrical conduit ran. I wrapped the photographs in extra oilcloth, sealed them as best I could against moisture and insects, and slid them into the darkness. Then I replaced the panel. If they were found, I would have no defense. If they were not, they might rot there unseen for decades, or someone might discover them someday and not know what they were, or perhaps I would come back for them, if life allowed. As it turned out, life did not allow. The occupation began. Allied officers arrived. They inspected our facilities, seized records, questioned officers. I was interrogated several times about my work. They wanted to know what I had photographed, where, when. Sometimes they showed me prints made from our own negatives, now in their hands. Pearl Harbor, Midway, the burned cities. They asked how I felt about having documented so much destruction. I did not answer honestly. I told them I had only done my duty, that a camera does not decide where it is pointed, that I had not been asked for my opinions, and so had not formed any. These were lies of convenience, but also a kind of truth. When you spend enough time looking through a lens, it becomes difficult to see your own face clearly. Later, I was called to assist at proceedings in a large hall where foreign judges sat on high benches and foreign lawyers questioned foreign defendants about decisions made in rooms I had never entered. They needed interpreters to help translate testimonies and documents. My experience with photographic evidence made me useful in tagging and explaining certain images. So once again, I became a conduit. This time, not between the sky and the operations room, but between the past and the record that would be kept of it. I watched as generals and ministers were confronted with photographs of things they had ordered or permitted or ignored. Massacres in China, camps in Southeast Asia, prisoners starved, civilians executed, entire villages wiped out. They looked at those images much as our own officers had looked at photographs of burned Japanese cities, some with anger, some with denial, some with something like shame, some with nothing at all. I translated their words. Sometimes I translated words spoken about photographs I myself had taken or processed without anyone in the room, knowing that the anonymous camera that had captured the scene had been held by the same man now standing quietly at the side of the courtroom, rendering language from one tongue to another. At night, away from the glare of the tribunal, I walked through a city slowly being rebuilt. New wooden houses rising in the shadows of scorched concrete shells, children playing among ruins as if they were merely another kind of landscape, neon signs beginning to appear in blacked-out streets. No one knew what had been hidden behind the panel in that dark room in the last days before surrender. No one asked. Life moved forward because it had to. Years passed, then decades. I left the service. The camera I had once carried on missions became a civilian tool. I photographed weddings, school graduations, factory openings, politicians shaking hands, families in new apartments, smiling faces, clean streets, fresh paint. I was good at it. The same skills that had once served to document war now captured peace. People said I had a talent for catching the right moment. A child's laugh, a proud father's expression, the instant when a ribbon snapped beneath ceremonial scissors. They praised my eye. They never asked what else that eye had seen. I married, had children, did not tell them much about the war. How could I? How does one explain to a child that their father had spent his youth looking down from the sky at men who were about to die, that he had photographed dead bodies as calmly as he now photographed birthday cakes? Sometimes, on nights when sleep would not come, I would think of the photographs hidden in that wall. I did not know if the building still stood, if the darkroom had been torn down and rebuilt, if renovations had revealed the bundle, if someone had thrown it away without unwrapping it, if it had rotted to pulp in the damp. Maybe it was better if no one ever saw them. Maybe it was better if the ghosts remained without faces. Other times I was certain the opposite was true, that without witnesses, even inanimate ones, the past would be rewritten entirely. I grew old. My hands, which had once been steady enough to hold a camera steady in turbulence, began to tremble again. Not from fear this time, but from age. My eyesight dimmed, the edges of the world blurring as if I were viewing it through faded glass. One day, in a small bookstore, I saw a foreign photography book on a shelf. It was about the war. The cover showed an image of a famous ruined dome in a southern city, its skeletal frame standing over a flattened landscape. Inside were pictures from both sides: American ships burning at Pearl Harbor, Japanese soldiers advancing through Malayan jungles, civilians fleeing firestorms in Tokyo. The captions spoke of tragedy, of bravery, of horror. I turned a page and stopped. There, in the middle of the book, was a photograph I recognized. A sailor floating in the water, face turned toward the sky, eyes and mouth filled with the ocean. I knew that image. I had taken it. I had kept it from official reports. I had hidden it in my private bundle, and yet here it was, printed on glossy paper for anyone to see. For a moment, the bookstore dissolved. I was back in the aircraft over the convoy, camera pressed to my face, hand steady as I framed the dead man in my viewfinder. Then I was in the darkroom, watching that face emerge in the tray. Then I was slipping the print into my own folder while smaller, safer images went into the official file. How had it reached this book? Had the bundle been found after all? Had someone else preserved the image along a different path? Had an American reconnaissance plane captured the same scene from another angle? I did not know. The caption did not mention the photographer's name. It rarely does. My hands shook as I closed the book. Not from age this time. On the walk home, I thought about that blurred frame from Pearl Harbor, about Tanaka's last photograph, about the cities burned from the sky and by a new kind of bomb, about the way we had filtered what we saw, and the way the victors were now filtering it in turn. History, I realized, was another kind of darkroom. Negatives went in. Some were developed, others were left in drawers. Some prints were displayed, others were lost. The final image the world saw was never the whole roll, only the selected frames. I had spent the war capturing images that others used to make decisions that killed men. After the war, others used different images to decide who should be blamed for which deaths. Throughout it all, the camera itself had remained indifferent. It had never cared who lived or died. It had only recorded. In the end, what remained was not justice or narrative or even memory. What remained were fragments. A sailor's face in water, a street turned to ash, a shadow burned into stone, a blurred handprint where the film had moved at the wrong moment, and somewhere, perhaps still hidden in a wall, perhaps dissolved into nothing long ago, a bundle of photographs that recorded what one man had seen and what others had chosen not to. If there is anything like truth in war, it does not live in speeches or reports or verdicts. It lives in those small, frozen moments when the lens opens and closes and captures something no one intended to admit. It lives in the images that make hands tremble, that cause men to drop pencils in silent rooms, that send photographers to sit alone on dark-room floors and finally, helplessly, weep. I was that photographer. I carried those images. I still carry them, even now when my hands can no longer hold a camera and my eyes can no longer focus on fine details. The war ended long ago. The cities have been rebuilt. Children play where ashes once lay. New photographs fill albums and screens. But in the quiet moments when I close my eyes, it is not those modern images that come. It is the man with the cigarette on the battleship deck, the sailor floating in the water, Tanaka's blurred frame, the skull in the ruins, the shadow on the steps. They come in sharp focus, one after another, as if some invisible hand were shuffling through a stack of prints, holding each one up to the light for me to see again. The world will remember other pictures, the famous ones, the ones chosen for books and documentaries and classrooms. That is as it should be. These are mine.